Hey, it's Max from UNFTR for the MeidasTouch network. So today I'm zagging a little bit to take a blended approach to a very serious discussion. So I'm typically here on Meidas to break down economic data releases to make economics a little more approachable. But the subtext is always about where we're headed under current policies. Now, over on UNFTR, I offer longer political diatribes. So what I wanted to do today was kind of bring them together, because I recently had this aha moment after watching Stephen Miller at the Charlie Kirk Memorial and then listening to Stephen Meerin, of all people, at the New York Economic Club in his first appearance as a Fed governor. And together, the Stephens reminded me of a report that came out before the re-election of Donald Trump, where investigative reporters from the UK went undercover to speak to Russell Vogt, who revealed details of Project 2025 because he thought they were conservative funders. Now, taken together, the economic rationale of this administration just sort of clicked, and it led me to this conspiracy. That's right. Evil bald men are destroying the U.S. economy on purpose to realize a white Christian nationalist vision for America. It just so happens that these three weasels are bald, but to the best of my knowledge, there's no correlation between white baldness and wanting to destroy America. I mean, no one's accusing George Costanza or Stanley Tucci of trying to ruin the economy. However, these three figures are central characters in a troubling and dystopian play with a plot so twisted it would make their hair curl, if they had any. Seriously, what I'm going to run through today is longer and more involved than usual, and it will, at times, seem to border on actual conspiracy. But the reason I can tell you this story is because, like prototypical Bond villains who reveal their dastardly plans to 007 before he foils them, these guys wrote it all down. So let me start with something that seems innocuous, but I consider very dangerous. Robert Reich wrote a piece that was amplified by several people like Heather Cox Richardson, where he likens ABC's acquiescence to the Jimmy Kimmel fiasco to the turning of the tide that he felt in the backlash to Joseph McCarthy or to Richard Nixon. Quote, "I know the signs. The sleeping giant will always remain asleep until some venality becomes so noxious, some action so disrespectful of the common good, some brutality so noisy that he has no choice but to awaken," end quote. Listen, I love Robert Reich. Even though he was part of the neoliberal Clinton administration, his personal stance and his work on economic inequality has been rock solid and consistent for decades, and his work these days to explain the fundamentals of inequality is next level. So I don't want to take anything away from him, but he's a widely followed person of influence. So the reason I consider this a dangerous statement is that he's talking about the wrong giant. The idea that a performative letter-writing campaign to get Jimmy Kimmel back on the air is somehow evidence of a liberal awakening and perhaps non-liberals coming over to our side is what leads people to be complacent. And by people, I'm talking about the Democratic Party and its leadership. Take a look at this slide. Now, I've shared it before, but it's been updated within the last couple of days to demonstrate the level of capture on the so-called other side. So this is the updated version of polling data from a company called Civics. And I encourage you to look them up if you're interested in polling, because it's online polling rather than landline, and it's consistently updated in real time. Now, you know from the wild disparities in some of their other surveys that the respondents are sensitive to certain events and conditions. But when it comes to this particular survey, when you isolate Republican respondents to the survey on the question of Trump's approval rating, it simply never moves. 90%. It stays at 90% no matter what. So after the big beautiful bill, after the tariff nonsense of Liberation Day, after bombing Iran, after bombing boats in Venezuela, after the Charlie Kirk Memorial when he came unglued, after saying Tylenol causes autism, after the Jimmy Kimmel fiasco, 90, 90, 90, 90, 90. He has complete capture of the Republican Party. We have to understand this. And that's why I caution everyone to get out of their bubbles. If you put your ear to the track of only one train line, that's the one that you hear coming. So in this piece, Reich highlights several moments over successive days that to him demonstrated executive overreach by the president, and concludes that the reinstatement of Kimmel might be some sort of watershed moment when the people turn against the administration and rise up. Not only is this patently false, But the administration is in fact going to double down on its efforts to crush dissent, even if they have to make up reasons to do so. And that's because their economic agenda is going to drive us into an even more severe recession that will create widespread discontent, and they are totally aware of this fact. This is the takeaway from what I'm about to lay out to you. They've planned for all of it. For all of it. They're counting on us having very public meltdowns and even violent responses to it. And if we don't, they're moving ahead with their agenda anyway. Trump is not Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was a lone senator, and that was a different time, nor is he Richard Nixon, because Trump got a second bite at the apple and had both Nixon's and his own mistakes to learn from. Trump's only role is to serve as the distractor in chief because the policy agenda is being carried out beneath him by the quietest but most nefarious actors the White House has ever seen. As the distractor in chief, though, Trump has been on a particularly grueling tour, addressing the United Nations with an isolationist and nationalistic speech, announcing a connection between Tylenol and autism, appearing at the Charlie Kirk Memorial and coming unglued, getting involved in the suspension of Kimmel. Yes, I get it. Day after day, he dominates the headlines of every media outlet in the world, while the seemingly banal technocrats do the busy work of dismantling the federal government. And the bottom line is, it's working. You know, before Trump was reelected, I cautioned the UNFTR audience that the real danger lay in his potential cabinet selections, not the attention-grabbing ones like Hegseth or Linda McMahon, who just obscured the bureaucratic ideologues in less prominent positions because of their absurdity. But once the cabinet was set, I identified 4 individuals who would carry out Trump's economic policy to ultimately tank the U.S. economy, my belief being on purpose. So Russell Vought, Stephen Meerin, Scott Bessent, and Howard Lutnick. Sorry. Now, I stand by this assertion, but it's clear that 2 of these men are emerging as the true architects of our decline, and it's Russell Vought and Stephen Meerin. And even more clear that I neglected to include another, and that's Stephen Miller. Now, on the surface, Miller appears to be a bit of an outlier in this grouping because it's an economic conversation, but his role is pivotal. Let me first dismiss Bessent and Lutnick. I've spent a lot of time on Meidas demonstrating their ineptitude and their propensity to simply lie to the cameras. And the first one's easy. Lutnick is such a buffoon that even the news shows are starting to shy away from having him on. But Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has become a fixture on all the major networks and the cable shows because of the confidence and the arrogance that he exudes. I mean, he's such a dick that it makes him somehow seem more believable. So I think it's a good time to revisit his track record so we can dispatch with the notion that he's anything more than a useful idiot for this administration. See, Bessent likes to promote his Wall Street bona fides and portray himself as a master of the markets. He just knows better than you. Well, just like the other villains we're about to cover who wrote down their plans to destroy America, Bessent too had to write down his financial disclosures prior to taking the role as Treasury Secretary and file public performance statements with FINRA and the SEC about his tenure as the head of his very own hedge fund, which he founded in 2015. So Bessent was a darling of Wall Street when he worked under George Soros. Yes, that George Soros, the one that Donald Trump said he wanted to target under RICO statutes for funding liberal political action committees. But when Bessent was steering someone else's ship and using their boat and their navigation and their teams, he did fine. And that gave him the confidence to start Key Square in 2015, a diversified hedge fund. And as you can see here in the disclosures, Bessent had a guaranteed income of over $1 million annually, plus $2.7 million in fees and incentives. A couple things to unpack. The first thing is that the people who manage hedge funds take enormous fees out for just being there. Performance up, performance down doesn't make a difference usually. They make a ton of money. So this doesn't tell anything about how good he was at his job, just that he makes a lot of money every year, at least from this thing. Now understand that this is the last year before he entered this administration, and he has since shut down that particular fund. But it's also important to understand that his financial disclosures are over 20 pages long. So this is just one little piece of it. He's not like us. But here's the fun part. Proof that you can get ahead as an average white guy on Wall Street if you know the right people and act like an arrogant asshole. His reputation under Soros was flying so high that he was able to woo investors to give him more than $5 billion in seed funding, one of the largest startup hedge fund hauls of all time. And by the end of 2023, which marks the end of most of the investable activity in the fund, Besant lost almost 90% of the fund's value. There was $577 million left in the fund as of the last filing, which is down from the more than $5 billion that he was given. Worse, only $300 million of it is what's called discretionary, meaning the fund management was allowed to invest it, while the other $250 million was non-discretionary, which meant that it's just sort of there to maintain a cash buffer against total loss. Now, let me offer you one basic comparison before we move on. Over the same period of time, between 2015 and 2023, the return on the S&P 500 was 167%. Do you know how colossally bad at your job you have to be to lose this much money during the greatest equities market expansion in the history of the US economy? Oh my God. So let me offer a counterintuitive declaration, and this is my view and my view alone. This kind of performance and outright dereliction is precisely why he's in charge of the Treasury. Truly, the phrase useful idiot was designed with him in mind. Now with that, let's go to our trio of baldies to unravel their agenda. Ever since Stephen Miller became a national figure, we've known of his virulent beliefs about immigrants and non-white people generally. Videos of him espousing his racist ideology from his earliest high school emerged almost immediately, which kept him mostly in the shadows during the first Trump term. But Miller has been unleashed in Trump's second term and is widely acknowledged as the sole architect of the mass deportation regime. He still uses coded language, but he's become increasingly emboldened, as illustrated by his unhinged performance at Charlie Kirk's memorial, which led a lot of people to remark that it was better in its original German.
You have no idea the dragon you have awakened. You have no idea how determined we will be to save this civilization, to save the West, to save this republic.
The important part of that cringeworthy clip is his reference to the West. The West is proxy for white Christendom in far-right literature, something Miller is keenly attuned to, as several investigative reports can attest. As the Southern Poverty Law Center revealed in 2019, leaked emails between Stephen Miller and Breitbart showed that Miller was a proponent of spreading a French novel called The Camp of the Saints to illustrate the dangers of open borders. The novel is a favorite among right-wing groups and Nazi sympathizers who see immigration as a threat to culture and bloodlines. So this is the fictional account of Stephen Miller's brain and wet dream, which has been unleashed on the American public in the form of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE. So how does this play into Trump's national and economic agenda? Well, it's not just related to it, it's central. White Christian nationalism provides the rationale for nearly every policy agenda in this administration. And again, how do we know this? Because they wrote it all down. So let's talk about what they wrote down, and then I'll show all of these bizarre economic policies of the administration and how they're designed to support it. You know, we have a nickname on UNFTR for Russell Vogt. We call him Rasputin because, like his namesake, he has the ear of the czar, and he's a madman. Only Vogt isn't a disheveled mystic. He's a basic, middle-aged, bald normie intent on destroying the administrative state, taking away a woman's right to choose, and sponsoring mass deportation. And in this case, don't even take his written word for it. Here he is, just saying it.
An organization that I helped turn into the Death Star that is accomplishing all the debates that you are reading about. I think you have to rehabilitate Christian nationalism. You have the largest deportation in history, block funding for Planned Parenthood. I want to be the person who crushes the deep state.
That's a clip from Democracy Now!'s coverage of an undercover investigation into Project 2025 by UK-based Center for Climate Reporting. So journalists posed as undercover conservative donors to gain access to Vogt, who was outed as the face of the Heritage Foundation's now infamous Project 2025 plan. So he had to take a back seat when Trump began distancing himself from it during the re-election campaign, though as Vogt acknowledges in the video, it was all a performance. Behind the scenes, the campaign was closely coordinating with Trump's people and preparing agency-specific transition plans and legal arguments for the lawsuits against their actions. Now, I cannot encourage you strongly enough to take the time to watch this expose because everything they said that they were going to do, they've done. I'm only going to play 1 minute of it now so that you can kind of get a sense of just how prepared they are and how far behind we are. So let's roll that first.
My time is working on the plans of what's necessary to take control of these bureaucracies. And we are working doggedly on that, whether it's destroying their agency's notion of independence. They're independent from the president.
Vogt has also been preparing documents based on fringe legal theories, arguing the president has the power to use the military against protesters.
George Floyd obviously was not about race. It was about destabilizing the Trump administration. Right. We put out, for instance, a 50-page paper designed for lawyers to know that the president has, the ability both along the border and elsewhere to maintain law and order with the military. And that's something that, it's going to be important for him to remember and his lawyers to affirm. But we've given them the case for that.
Yeah, chilling stuff, right? And this is only a minute of it. So like I said, do yourself a favor. If you've never seen this, click the link in the description and check it out. It's really important stuff. But notice in this brief clip, there's two things that he explicitly lays out: destroying agencies and deploying the military domestically. Now, we know these things have happened, but that's not even the part that I want to draw your attention to. It's this part, again.
We put out, for instance, a 50-page paper designed for lawyers to know that the president has, the ability both along the border and elsewhere to maintain law and order with the military. And that's something that, it's going to be important for him to remember and his lawyers to affirm.
See, that's the key to me. See, they knew that Democrats and nonprofits and NGOs would all take them to court over this stuff, and they were prepared for it all in advance. These guys were so far ahead of the Democratic Party, it's beyond belief. So let's go through the highlights of their plan to contextualize their economic agenda. See, Project 2025 is the most well-known of the Heritage Foundation plans because of the media circus that surrounded it. But there's a companion piece that was released shortly before the re-election of Trump called Project Esther, that's also from Heritage, and it focused on how to crush dissent. So Project Esther was sold as a way to fight against anti-Semitism, given the campus protests against the war in Gaza. But most of us saw it for what it really was. It was a guide to dismantle all protest movements by labeling them as national security threats. So then there are the kind of agency-specific guidelines for how to self-dismantle. But those are, to the best of my knowledge, still under wraps. And the reason for that is actually given in the longer video if you watch that Democracy Now! Piece. There's actually a guy who's also undercover who says that they didn't even give copies of it out to anybody because they didn't want it to get into the wrong hands. They wouldn't even email them. So they waited until the people were in the positions to literally read through it and have them basically enact these plans to dismantle the very agencies that they were given control of. So we can certainly see the evidence of it in real time, just like we can see the effectiveness of the predetermined legal guidelines on how to defend these actions, given that the Supreme Court has upheld the president's ability to A, strip them of authority, and B, go so far as to claw back funds that were appropriated by the prior administration and given the green light from Congress. To be clear, this was a specific directive from Russell Vogt directly, who argued that the executive has the legal authority to do all of this under an order called impoundment, even though this was specifically outlawed in 1974 in response to Nixon doing the exact same thing. So we have their blueprints in Project 2025, Project Esther, and presumably the agency-level guidelines that were written down to self-destruct like Mission Impossible instructions. But taken together, they tackled the 5 umbrella agenda items of this administration. Number 1, tax cuts for the wealthy under the spurious and disproven trickle-down job creator theory. Number 2, deregulation, to allow corporations unfettered access to build anything, trade anything, and to create monopolies. Number 3, halt the flow of immigration, especially from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and to embark on mass deportation of immigrant populations already in the United States. Number 4, eliminate abortion access and even birth control, a curious one that we'll come back to. And number 5, consolidate domestic law enforcement and military authority under the Office of the Executive through the declaration of emergency powers at all times and in perpetuity. That's about the sum total of it. Nearly every move of this administration can be tied back to these central tenets of Project 2025 and Project Esther. As I said, like a bad Bond villain, they explained it all before they did it. Unfortunately for us, the Democratic establishment is no James Bond. Which brings us to the economic policies that undergird these projects. Enter Stephen Meerin. So recall that Meerin got the job in the White House as the head of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors from a white paper that he wrote in 2024, claiming the tariffs would level the trade imbalance between the U.S. and other major economies without causing inflation. So in a prior video, we went into detail on how his entire theory is built on something called the Triffin dilemma, which itself is based on the potential to destroy the US dollar because it's tied to the value of gold. So, once Nixon eliminated this tether to gold in 1971, the whole idea was moot. Nevertheless, he persisted and got the job. So, Meerin was also recently confirmed as a Federal Reserve governor to replace Adriana Kugler, who departed for reasons that have yet to emerge. And even though a new plan was created to actually have Meerin take Lisa Cook's position after Trump unsuccessfully tried to fire her, we'll see where that goes. And the reason they did that is because she had a longer term. So the courts rebuffed this attempt, so for the time being, Cook is still in the position. So they went back to Plan A, replacing Kugler with Meerin. So during the FOMC meeting, Meerin was the lone dissenting voice on the board to reduce the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. In his dissent, he said that it should have been way more significant. Now, the reason this is important is because the Federal Reserve is supposed to maintain complete independence, as you've probably heard a lot of people say. But in Meirin's first meeting, he essentially carried water for the president and went against the other 11 members in their consensus, some of whom, by the way, are considered Trump loyalists. And he called for significant rate cuts. And this is important. Before I explain why, let's talk about Fed independence and what Meerin truly represents on the board. You see, I knew about his tariff white paper, the one that got him the job, but what I wasn't aware of is another white paper that he co-authored several months prior to that one that laid out a plan to deliver wholesale change to the Federal Reserve, and this is where it gets really interesting. After his dissenting vote, Meerin was invited to offer remarks at the New York Economic Club, where he attempted to mathematically explain his rationale for the sweeping rate cuts and defend his ability to maintain independence. But there was a pointed question in the Q&A that drew my attention to that prior paper that he co-authored and published for the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank. And in it, he called for the Federal Reserve to be completely transformed. So let's start with the comedy first. In the paper, Meerin accused past Fed governors of being too political, saying, quote, "To pretend that one can easily shift between highly political and allegedly non-political roles without letting political biases inform policy is at best naive, at worst sinister." Sinister? Whew, them's fighting words. Here's the thing. Meerin is literally on leave from the White House. That's right. Apparently no one else on the planet was able to fill Kugler's position, so Meerin still technically has his job at the White House because Kugler's term isn't as long as the others. But wait, it gets even better because he goes on to say this: excessive control by elected political actors like the president interferes in good policy and results in bad economic outcomes. End quote. This guy, he's too much. So here's where the rubber meets the road, and the whole thing comes unraveled. This is what Meerin goes on to recommend in the report. First off, he calls for a prohibition on Fed governors serving in the executive branch for a period of 4 years after their term. Which sounds good to me, buddy boy. Guess it just doesn't apply to you, and consider you're literally in both places at once. He then goes on to attack the Fed for having DEI policies, like investigating whether monetary policy has had a negative impact on structural racism, which seems to me like a legitimate question for an agency to ask, but according to him and all of Project 2025, it's just a waste of time. He goes on to laud chairs like Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan, even though Volcker prescribed the opposite remedy in a stagflation crisis than the one that Meirin just put forward. And most people recognize that Alan Greenspan presided over the expansive monetary environment followed by extreme tightening that led to the mortgage crisis. But here's where it gets sinister, to borrow a word. To fix the Fed, Meirin suggested that the operating budget be brought under House appropriations. Hold that thought. He said the Fed shouldn't have the ability to fight monetary crises, that decision should belong to the president. Hold that thought. And that reserve banks should be nationalized, with the heads of them being appointed by governors of states that they're located in. Okay, one by one. The Fed is self-sustaining because it makes money from seigniorage, the fees associated with literally printing money, and the spread from the money that they lend into the market. He wants that to go away so that Congress can authorize the Fed budget. But now go back to the whole appropriations thing and what Russell Vought's working on, because we've seen with this collaboration with Vogt that their plan is to strip appropriations away from Congress and place it under executive authority. So the president would theoretically control all the funding of the Fed. The president would also then have the ability to determine when and if the Fed intervenes in the markets during a crisis, which would make the president the sole arbiter of winners and losers in the event of a crash. Control of the board being given to state governors is a curious thing, because conveniently, there are more red state governors than blue ones. Essentially, Meirin's plan to secure independence of the Fed is to strip it of all independence and place it under the sole authority of the President of the United States. Now, to explain his position on rate cuts and bring this all home, to put it in the context of the pillars of our projects, tax cuts, deregulation, mass deportation, restricting access to birth control, and policing the streets with the military, let's hear from Meirin himself. Now, don't worry. This is only a 20-second clip. I won't bore you too much.
To sum it all up, we have to first adjust R star relative to a baseline of factors, relative to a baseline based on the factors I described. A variety of models reviewed by Gianluca Benigno and others arrive at a median real estimate for R star of 1.3% in a range of around 1 to 2%.
Now, wait a minute. He didn't mention any of those things. All he said was that rates should be 1.3%. True. Let's figure out why, though. Okay, so his technical argument references something called R star, and he gave a summary of the mathematical rationale for cutting the rates to 1.3%. And this is his personal preference, by the way, his base case. And R star is just the term for what the Fed considers to be a neutral rate under something called the Taylor rule. Basically, what rate the governors believe will maintain inflation and unemployment at their preferred targets. Fine. So what Meirin did was he adjusted the inputs in this very wonky way to suggest that literally everyone else is seeing the economy wrong and that rates should be 1.3%, maybe lower. But he goes on to graciously allow for other opinions and states that settling around 2% would be fair. And the recent consensus brought the target range from down to between 4 and 4.25%. So right now it currently sits at 4.1%. So to understand that Meirin fought for the rates to be cut in half from where they got cut to, making the case here that in his heart it should be 1.3%. So why is this important? How does it all tie together? Deep breath. You ready? They want to drastically cut rates to stimulate the top end of the corporate economy to cover for the other areas of the administration's agenda that are going to tank it for the vast majority of us. And they want to take control of Fed operations and powers so that they have exclusive authority to print money and direct it when the shit hits the fan. So let's look at their first agenda item, cut taxes, right? Cutting taxes is a gift to the corporate class and to the wealthy. We already know this. But it also depletes the Treasury, and it contributes to an even widening budget deficit, thus the tariffs. And Meirin is the one that gave them the rationale to implement them. So they know that we as consumers are ultimately going to pick up the tab for that. But tariffs are a short-term budget gap closer because they bring in unattached funds, meaning it's pure revenue for the government, even if the taxes on the goods are initially paid by the importing corporations. So that's going to be untenable in the long run. They also know that. So they're removing as many administrative costs and barriers for corporations as possible to offset the cost of the tariffs, deregulation. So corporations are free to price gouge without the CFPB breathing down its neck. to form monopolies without the FTC stopping them, to pollute freely without the EPA fining them, and so on. So regulations also cost money. So whatever losses mega corporations sustain from paying tariffs, they can partially offset them by not paying to remain compliant with federal regulations. Even still, it's short term, especially when you consider part 3, which is mass deportation. In the pursuit of a white America, the Christian nationalists, the votes that vote mentioned by name, need to be rehabilitated in reputation. So when mass deportation occurs, they'll say it's to rid the country of criminals, except that Asians, Latinos, and Black people are the only targets, and the vast majority are here legally in that they sought asylum, and they're pending adjudication in the courts. That's legal. That's the so-called right way, as defenders of deportation like to say. Now, the flip side to mass deportation is that you gut low-wage jobs in construction, retail, hospitality, healthcare, and agriculture. And they know this too, which is why they have a twofold plan to fill these positions with a population desperate for work, even low wages, and to stimulate the corporate economy to prevent them from mass white-collar layoffs when the economy inevitably falls in on itself. So that latter piece is accomplished by slashing the federal funds rate, which helps one class and one class only, despite what they say. All right. The corporate class is the only one positioned to take advantage of a federal funds rate cut. They'll tell you it's to make all borrowing more affordable across the lending spectrum, from credit cards to mortgages, but that's not how it works. Now, credit cards are tied to the federal funds rate, but the average spread on credit cards is 14.5%. So at best, credit card debt holders can look forward to reducing interest rates from 20% to 16%. And that's for regular borrowers. The subprime market is way worse than that. So there's a correlation between student loan debt and the federal funds rate, but that's for new borrowers. And they're looking to cut back on federal student loan guarantees and Pell Grants anyway, which should tell you that they're not really serious about tackling that issue either. And mortgages are tied to the 10-year mortgage rate, not the federal funds rate. And the further you get out on the yield curve, the 10-year and the 30-year, the more expensive debt will become, specifically because they're gutting the rest of the economy. And here again, we know why they don't care about that, about the long end of the curve. Take a look at these 3 charts. The first is the 30-year Treasury yield. Now, currently, it stands at 4.7%, and the last time it was at this level was in the run-up to the Great Financial Crisis. That's because it's a reflection of the long-term sentiment of the economy. In other words, we pay a premium for the 30-year because investors are losing faith in our ability to manage the economy. Now take a look at the 10-year rate, which is what mortgages are tied to. Here again, the 10 is at 4.1%, and the last time it hit this rate was the run-up to the global financial crisis. So despite the rate cut and the signal that 2 more are coming this year, the most recent data still show that the market isn't budging because investors know that even the midterm health of the economy is in question. So no, your mortgage rate not going down. And now look at the 1 year. This is what matters more to the administration. While still high relative to where we were, you can see 2 things. The first is that the short-term notes are coming down, but they remain elevated at 3.6%, which once again, we haven't seen since the financial crisis. But 3.6% is a lot better than 4.1% and almost a full point better than the 30-year at 4.7%. Now, tellingly, it came down in the recent weeks because there was an indication that the federal funds rate was also going to come down. And that's how you know that the short-term yields are very closely tied to the federal funds rate. Because here's what they're doing. And here's why Meerin is desperately advocating for a massive rate cut. These short-term yields are directly tied to the federal funds rate. If the Fed suddenly cut rates, it would wreak havoc in the bond markets, but produce immediate gains in the stock market because investors would be desperate for yields and a quick place to park their cash. See, they've been getting handsome returns on short-term instruments that are priced nicely and also extremely liquid. But apart from pushing investors to the equities market, it also gives the U.S. the short-term opportunity to load up new debt in the short-term treasury auctions. You see, this administration has done such a poor job that Besant has been forced to pull back on long-term bond auctions because buyers want a premium for our debt and our mismanagement, which only widens the budget gap. So he's pushing stablecoins, for example, which are only allowed to buy short-term instruments, and for the Fed to refinance outstanding debt at these low rates. Now, if the market doesn't cooperate, the plan is to do something called yield curve control, which we also talked about in another video. And the last time we did that was in the 1940s and the early 50s to overpurchase our own short-term treasuries. That's a quick fix to refinance debt, but it has disastrous inflationary consequences. And they do not care. They are willing to increase inflation with tariffs and short-term purchases like this and to sacrifice the job market in order to get the debt partially under control and to deliver cash to corporate America by allowing it to refinance more expensive debt and take advantage of the flow of cash into the stock market. That's the game. And what they're banking on is that immigrant labor at the low end of the job market is utterly destroyed, leaving current job seekers with no alternative but to fill low-wage jobs that are typically done by first-generation immigrant populations. And that brings us to the social and political equation. Numbers 4 and 5 on their agenda, which seem like outliers, but they're connected. Stripping away access to reproductive health care and control over the military. Now remember, Russell Vought's words, not mine. You heard them yourself. The first part relates to Stephen Miller's white nationalist fantasy and the problem of low white birth rates in America. How do you solve that? You deport as many immigrants as possible, and you remove reproductive health care like abortion and access to birth control to the remaining, hopefully, white population. And then you give every newborn baby $1,000 in something called a Trump account, which is now law, by the way, to incentivize babies born to U.S.-born residents. It's sick, but that's what's up. And when all else fails, there's the nuclear fifth option that they've already laid the table for, to militarize domestic law enforcement and put it under executive authority. If people take to the streets for the failing economy and communities that have been ripped apart, you have to make sure that you've provided the legal justification to the Supreme Court that the president can call up the military to police the streets and effectively end posse comitatus. And I give you ICE border control and the street gangs that they've become in the end of due process. I give you the takeover of D.C., Los Angeles, the threat to send troops to Chicago and New York. This is happening. This is happening in real time, and it's all going according to plan. So I'll give you my final thoughts to bring you fully into the discussion that we've been having for 5 years on UNFTR. They want you to think that it's us against them, that it's red versus blue. That's what the distractor in chief is selling us. That's why he's there. But the reality is, this is the same class struggle that has always been there. Only they're operating under the most sophisticated blueprint ever recorded. Project 2025, Project Esther, the Manhattan Institute white paper to take control of central bank authority. These aren't current manifestations and recent designs. These are end caps. Russell Vogt, Stephen Miller, Stephen Meerin, they're not the progenitors of this white nationalist fantasy for America. They're the heirs to it. This was all set in motion a long time ago with the passage of Brown v. the Board of Education. This project of theirs has come under a lot of names, and it's been promoted by countless organizations over the years, but the roots go back to the same source, that we are a nation founded on genocide of native peoples and built on slavery. And this root system runs deep, and it is bloodstained. So you might think that my animus is actually directed exclusively at the right. Not at all. It's also obvious. You can spot them coming from a mile away. That's, to me, never the danger. My anger is directed toward the liberal establishment, to the Ezra Kleins and the TYTs of the world that want to dialogue with the right and bring everyone under the same tent. Not me. Unless and until we get our house in order, these conversations will end up in compromise and capitulation, just like Chuck Schumer will always compromise with the Republicans. Chuck, you gotta go. Just like Hakeem Jeffries cannot see his way to endorse the Democratic nominee for mayor of New York City. Not only did Zoran Mamdani win the primary of the party that he serves as the head of, but he won Jeffries' district. And he still can't bring himself to endorse him. Just like the DNC pushed out David Hogg for suggesting that Democrats with poor progressive voting records who represent safely blue districts should be primaried in order to get in step with the direction that the voters want to go. Literally the path of least resistance to reforming the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris is on tour right now, pointing the finger at everyone from voters to Joe Biden, without looking in the mirror to realize that her campaign platform was to be tougher on the border than Donald Trump. That she was the one who put prisoners behind bars as one of the least progressive prosecutors ever to come out of California. That she carried a Glock, stayed silent on the war in Gaza, and suggested that everything was fine in the U.S. economy instead of owning up to the fact that people were suffering in red and blue states all along the political divide. The Democrats tried so hard to run right of the right wing that they lost the base, and with it, they lost the plot. These corporate Democrats, they got to go. I mean, who's offering a different vision? Any vision? Where did the conversation for Medicare for All go? A bold, radical, authentically liberal vision is required to restore the faith in the electorate, and there isn't a single leader in the Democratic Party with the balls to offer it, outside of an 84-year-old man from Vermont who's killing himself to travel throughout the whole nation to tell people face to face that we can do better. This man that the establishment has continuously silenced and belittled. Now, I'm not saying Bernie has all the answers, but how much more of a hint do these corporate Democrats need? You want to tell me that a sleeping giant was awakened because of some letter-writing campaign to keep a millionaire comedian on the air? Awakened to do what? Where is our project? Where's our plan? You want me to embrace some McKinsey Buttigieg type figure who suggested that the way to stop the war in Gaza is to put our arm around our friend Israel and ask him to do better? Or the California governor who gave the order to forcibly clear out the homeless encampments, vetoed universal health care in his state, and went back on his word to the unions? You want to rerun the Glock-carrying prosecutor who was tough on crime and immigration? I have an idea. How about reach out to Hillary? I hear she's free. To break this cycle of corporate neoliberal Democrat McKinsey compromise, we need bold new leaders and visionaries because we have been outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outplanned for decades. Our side is so bad, this guy won twice. He wasn't a fluke. He was inevitable. So it's time to get radical and to rediscover our progressive roots. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at UNFTR. Until then, heads down, elbows up.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.